Thank you, Professor Blackburn. Professor Robert Pollin, a distinguished graduate of the New School Economics Department and Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Akil. I never met Akil until about a half an hour ago, but he was the one that proposed this topic to me, and just to show you how much influence I have over him, I suggested that we not do it. That I said, well, why don't we debate not terms, not words, but social reality? And so we're debating social reality around the term. My own confrontation with understanding imperialism actually seriously starts here when I was, as Sanjay said, a graduate student, and I took Professor Sheikh's class in international economics, 2 semesters, and we read the classic works and contemporary works in imperialism and other things. I also, my first semester here, was a student of Paul Sweezy, and in Sweezy and Magdoff's development of the nature of U.S. imperialism and the centrality of U.S. imperialism. I absorbed that, and I'm going to refer to that. I also have a connection with my very dear friend Prabhat Patnaik on this specific issue, because in 1990 Prabhat was a visiting professor at University of California, Riverside, where I was teaching, and one day he handed me an essay that he had just finished called Whatever Happened to Imperialism. So Prabhat's been on this point for a long time. So we are still debating whatever happened to imperialism. I did tell Akil that I didn't know exactly what David Harvey's position was, but that I thought that I was broadly sympathetic to it, so I'm going to flag that point right now. Now, let me just raise a few points. Let's start with some simple things. Capitalism proceeds through historical epochs, or what another professor of mine, David Gordon here, called social structures of accumulation. And I think it's a helpful way to organize historical reality, economic realities, to think about these broad epochs. Now, of course, epochs don't just operate in a static way and then die like a one-horse shay that drops. They have a dynamic component. They're changing even within an epoch, but epochs live, they have peaks, and then they die. Now, if we start with, which both Prabhat and Robin talked about, our contemporary of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, of course, is in crisis. We don't know what's coming next. But neoliberalism certainly has the features of, some of the features, obviously, the acceptance of the notion of the hegemony of capital, of some notion of free market capital. It's not free market capitalism because, of course, capitalists want to get bailed out. They want benefits when they need them from the state, but otherwise they want to be free of regulation, and we think about regulation around trade, around labor markets, and around financial markets. So those are the key features of neoliberalism, and neoliberalism has dominated for 30 to 35 years at this point. Now, even during the era of neoliberalism, throughout the period, it wasn't true that all countries were proceeding along a neoliberal path, and the most obvious case is China. Whatever we may want to call what China has done over the last generation, we can't say that it's operated in the absence of a strong state guiding its development. In a totally different context, Latin America, of course, for the past 10 to 15 years, has undergone tremendous transformation in direct opposition to neoliberalism, with the election of left-of-center governments throughout the region that have actually been sustained and strengthened. Indeed, Prabhat and I were just in Ecuador a month ago, and we're talking to people in the very interesting left government. Maybe we'll have time to talk about that. Okay, now the era of neoliberalism was preceded, as we also know, by what has come to be known as the golden age of capitalism. Now, when I was a graduate student here, we were debating this, we never called it the golden age of capitalism. We never thought capitalism was all that golden. But I guess in retrospect, relative to neoliberalism, it looks good. Now, the golden age of capitalism, what are some of the features Robin briefly mentioned? The golden age of capitalism was characterized by the working class of U.S. and the other advanced countries benefiting from economic growth, that wages were rising roughly in correspondence with productivity, that you develop a substantial welfare state. The welfare state is taken for granted, even by right-wing governments come into power, like in the U.S. The last real progressive president, anyway, in the United States was, of course, Richard Nixon. Nixon's policies, if you look at them in absolute terms, are far to the left of Obama. And that was because he was the last vestige of the golden age, the so-called golden age era as experienced in the United States. Now, as was pointed out, of course, it has been pointed out many, many times, and was pointed out at the time, the golden age, of course, was never really golden for a lot of people. We talk about the experience of African Americans, of women in this country, but the big broader perspective is the golden age was also the age of imperialism. If we want to take the term from one of my classic books that I brought, Harry Magdoff, Age of Imperialism. So the Age of Imperialism was also the golden age, interestingly. The other classic book I brought, of course, is Prabhat Patnaik, Whatever Happened to Imperialism. Now, what were the features of the Age of Imperialism as in the way that Sweezy and Magdoff talked about it? Well, yes, U.S. global hegemony was central. And why was the U.S. So insistent on global hegemony? Well, number one, to stop the advance of socialism. And to, as Prabhat said, to extend control over as much territory as possible. At the time, the notion of a challenge, a fundamental challenge to capitalism, U.S. capitalism, was very much present, obviously, because roughly a third of the world's population, in some sense, called themselves socialist. In addition to that, the three other features that were central to the U.S. hegemony were control over raw materials, oil being the most important one, control over global markets, and the opportunity to exploit cheap labor. Now, the U.S. was perfectly willing to fight wars, and did fight wars, to maintain its hegemony during this age of imperialism, but it was not really the purpose of having power was to fight wars. Indeed, as Prabhat very astutely points out, when U.S. imperialism had to fight wars, that was actually a sign of weakness, a sign of failure, not a sign of strength, because it's much better to maintain control without having to fight wars. A prime example of that was the 1953 coup in Iran, where the government of Mohammad Mossadegh had nationalized the oil industry, and that was obviously unacceptable to the United States, and the United States CIA, without any war, overthrew Mossadegh and brought the Shah of Iran back in. Imagine, the world trajectory that would have occurred had Mossadegh come in and we had an entirely different system over the control of oil. Now, another key point, and I guess Robin mentioned this, and I have to stress this one, is that the premise of Sweezy and Magdoff was that, and it's in Monopoly Capital, was that the U.S. working class was benefiting from imperialism. Or maybe both of you mentioned it. And so that's where you get the link between the golden age and the age of imperialism. That is that one of the key features that enabled the golden age to proceed was that the working class in the U.S. and in the other advanced economies were benefiting from the exploitation of the third world, and that was how the U.S. imperialism could proceed in a way that you could also obtain the support of the U.S. working class. Now, another feature of the age of imperialism, of course, now we're not going to think about the U.S. so much, is the idea, and this was also absolutely central, certainly central in the course I took here with Anu when we studied theories of dependency and so forth, was that U.S. imperialism was blocking third world development. And I want to just read from an essay that was by Tom Weiskopf in the IRPI Review of 1973 that was a survey on exactly the topic we're debating, the concept of imperialism. And he says, Tom says as follows: in the absence of a revolutionary transformation of the domestic class structure, an ex-colonial underdeveloped country faces a choice between economic stagnation or economic dependence on the major capitalist powers. The latter reinforces the dependency relationship by strengthening those domestic classes most interested in a Western-oriented capitalist path of economic growth. Thus, dependence and imperialism are closely interwoven together in the fabric of international capitalism. Okay, now let's think about what has changed in this transition from the golden age / imperialist age to the neoliberal age. And this is where I think, and again, I have no idea what David Harvey actually thought, but I think that it's, my own view is that we have to kind of place the concept of imperialism in a different context than one that at least I had thought about it for a long time. Okay, what's changed? Well, obviously, state socialism no longer exists. Secondly, class compromise within advanced economies has ended. And again, I want to stress this. We had this, the golden age was workers' wages were rising with productivity. Now productivity is still rising and workers' wages are flat or declining. The globalization and financialization has meant that the centrality of state power diminishes with respect to economic incomes. More precisely, it's more important for capital to be integrated globally and to have access to all countries under all circumstances, and it doesn't really matter, certainly to the extent it did under the Golden Age, what the nationality of capital is. Third world countries, and again, this is something that I think it's important to stress. Weiskopf and others, with respect to the dependency theory, were wrong on many points. They were right on some, they were wrong. Obviously, less developed countries have grown. They've grown in the face of capitalism. They have grown as capitalist countries. It started with the Asian tigers. It includes China and India. And they grew largely on the basis of being integrated into the global order through exports. Now, as Weiskopf himself said in 1973, he also said that, well, even if third world countries are going to be able to grow, let's think about the nature of the growth. It will include mass unemployment. It will include ever-widening inequalities of income and wealth. And it will include the breakdown of traditional norms and institutions of community and solidarity without creating something alternative in its place. All of those things are actually right. So the dependency theory was wrong in asserting that third world countries could not grow within a context of capitalism, but they were right, at least in the way that Weiskopf presents it, in saying the nature of growth is going to intensify the nature of exploitation under capitalism, as Robin pointed out. Now, what about oil and commodity prices? In Prabat's 1990 essay, and he referred back to this point again, the problem, he said, was that commodity prices would be disastrously low, were disastrously low. Now we have exactly the opposite problem, that commodity prices, food and oil in particular, are disastrously high. And these disastrously high prices, certainly the price of food having doubled twice over the course of the last 3 years, has led to mass immiseration, malnutrition, as the United Nations has pointed out, and even Gary Gensler, the head of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission in D.C., Washington, fully acknowledges, and the price of oil also has spiked 3 times now. Now, why is this? This is not, in my view, not due to the power of the capitalist state. It's due to the power of finance capital. It's due to the nature of the financialization of the commodities futures market and the role of speculation in the market. So it is the capture of financialization and globalization being integrated into establishing the price of commodities. And at that point I say, okay, we are clearly in a different world. Now, should we call it imperialism? This is my point back to Aki. I don't know. It certainly is not the way that at least the way I thought about imperialism when we think about the age of imperialism, the Sweezy-Magdoff type formulation, the Weisskopf formulation, and I would say maybe even the earlier Prabhat Patnaik formulation. So certainly there is imperialist exploitation and wars, but I think we have to rethink the nature of the epoch that we're living in and understand its particular features. Thank you.